The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he dismounted his weathered horse outside the general store in Redemption Creek. The town had seen better days, much like everything else in this corner of the Texas frontier in 1887. Paint peeled from the storefronts, and tumbleweeds danced through the empty streets like ghosts of prosperity past. Jake pulled his hat down against the afternoon sun and tied his reins to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, following a lead on some rustled cattle that had gone cold faster than morning coffee. The disappointment sat heavy in his chest, another failure to add to the growing pile. At 32, Jake had seen enough of life's hardships to know that some battles couldn't be won with bullets or determination alone. The small ranch he'd inherited from his father was slowly dying, choked by drought, debt, and the changing times that favored bigger operations with deeper pockets. As he stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, the sound of his spurs echoing in the quiet afternoon, Jake noticed her immediately. A small figure huddled in the narrow alley between the general store and the barber shop, partially hidden in the shadows. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold and eyes the color of prairie grass after rain. Her dress, once probably blue, was now a patchwork of dust and desperation. But it wasn't the child alone that made Jake's heart clench with sudden recognition of shared sorrow. Behind her, seated on what appeared to be a makeshift bed of blankets, was a woman who looked to be in her 20s. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. Mother and daughter cast adrift in a world that had little patience for the lost and broken. The woman's eyes held a vacant quality that Jake had seen before in men who'd returned from the war, with pieces of their souls left on distant battlefields. The little girl looked up as Jake approached, her small chin jutting out with a defiance that reminded him painfully of his own sister before consumption had taken her. There was pride there mixed with desperation, and something in those green eyes that spoke of burdens no child should carry. "Mister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of mountains, "my mama can't speak, and we're so alone. Could you maybe help us find shelter over our heads?" The words hit Jake like a physical blow, not because of their content, but because of the careful way she'd constructed them. This wasn't the first time she'd made this plea, he realized. The practiced politeness, the way she kept her body positioned protectively between him and her mother, the resignation that flickered behind the hope in her eyes, it all spoke of a child who'd grown up too fast in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Jake knelt down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. "What's your name, little miss?" "Lucy," she replied, then added with fierce protectiveness. "And this is my mama, Rose. She used to talk all the time, used to sing to me every night. But something happened, and now she can't make words come out anymore." Jake's gaze shifted to the woman Rose and saw the pain that lived in her silence. Her hands moved restlessly in her lap, fingers forming shapes as if trying to capture words that no longer existed for her. There were fading bruises on her wrists, almost healed but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. The story began to write itself in Jake's mind, a tale too common in these harsh times: violence, loss, trauma that had stolen more than just words. "How long you two been on your own?" Jake asked gently. Lucy's small shoulders sagged slightly. "Since the spring rains, Mama and me. We had a little house outside Millerville, but after the bad thing happened, we couldn't stay. Mama stopped talking, and the people in town, they looked at us like we were broken things that needed fixing or throwing away." The casual cruelty in her words made Jake's jaw tighten. He'd seen it before. The way some communities turned their backs on those who reminded them, too starkly, of their own vulnerability. It was easier to blame the victims than to confront the darkness that could touch any life. "We've been walking mostly," Lucy continued, absently smoothing down her mother's hair with a tenderness that broke Jakey's heart. "Sometimes folks give us food or let us sleep in their barn for a night. But winter's coming, and Mama's getting thinner. I don't know what to do anymore." The admission cost her. Jake could see it in the way her small frame seemed to fold in on itself. This child had been holding up the entire world on her narrow shoulders, and the weight was finally becoming too much to bear. Jake made a decision that would change all their lives, though he didn't know it yet. It came from someplace deeper than logic or self-interest. From the part of him that remembered his father's voice, saying that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to give when giving cost him everything. "I've got a ranch about 2 hours' ride from here," he said, watching hope flicker in Lucy's eyes like a candle flame in wind. "It's not much to look at, and I won't lie to you, times are hard. But there's a roof and walls, and nobody there to look at you like you're broken." Rosie's head lifted for the first time during their conversation, her eyes meeting Jake's with an intensity that spoke volumes. There was intelligence there and gratitude, and a mother's desperate love for her child. She reached out slowly and touched Jake's arm, her fingers light as butterfly wings but somehow conveying more thanks than words could have managed. "You mean it, mister." Lucy's voice cracked slightly. "You'd really let us stay." "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, standing and offering his hand to help Lucy to her feet. "And yes, I mean it. But I should tell you, it's going to be work. I can't afford to hire help, and the place needs more fixing than one man can manage alone. If you're willing to pull your weight, both of you, then we might just make something of it together." Lucy took his hand with both of hers, and Jake was struck by how small and cold her fingers were. "We're not afraid of work, Mr. Morrison. Mama and me. We're stronger than we look." The journey to Jake's ranch took them through country that had once been green and prosperous but now bore the scars of too many dry seasons and too little hope. They rode slowly, Jake on his horse with Lucy perched behind him, her thin arms wrapped around his waist with complete trust that humbled him. Rose rode the spare mare Jake had brought, sitting straight in the saddle despite her silence, her eyes taking in everything around them as if cataloging details for some internal map. As they rode, Lucy filled the silence with a stream of observations and questions that revealed a mind sharp as a steel trap despite her circumstances. She noticed things, the way the cattle gathered under the few remaining trees, the direction of the wind, the quality of the grass in different areas. It was clear she'd absorbed more knowledge about frontier life than many adults possessed. "Mama used to teach school," Lucy said during one of their rest stops, as if reading Jake's thoughts. "Before we came out here, before Daddy died of the fever. She taught me my letters and numbers, and about plants and animals and how to read the sky for weather." Rose's face softened at the mention of teaching, and she reached into a small bag tied to her saddle, producing a battered book that she pressed into Lucy's hands. The child's face lit up as she opened it, revealing pages covered in careful drawings of plants and flowers, each one labeled in a precise, feminine hand. "Mama made this," Lucy explained proudly. "She drew every flower and leaf we found on our journey. She can't talk, but she still teaches me things. She just does it different now." Jake studied the drawings as Lucy flipped through the pages. They were remarkably detailed and accurate, the work of someone with both artistic talent and scientific knowledge. An idea began to form in the back of his mind, but he pushed it aside for later consideration. The sun was setting when they finally reached the Morrison Ranch, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Jake of better times. The house stood at the end of a dirt road, a modest 2-story structure built by his father's hands 40 years earlier. The paint was weathered and several shutters hung askew, but the bones of the building were solid. Behind it stood a barn that had seen better days and a collection of outbuildings in various states of repair. Lucy slid down from the horse and stood looking at the house with wide eyes. It wasn't grand by any measure, but after months of sleeping under stars and in temporary shelters, it must have seemed like a palace. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Jake realized she meant it. Beauty, he understood, was often a matter of context rather than objective reality. Rose dismounted more slowly, her legs unsteady after the long ride. She walked toward the house with careful steps, her hand trailing along the porch railing as if testing its solidity. When she reached the front steps, she sat down heavily and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that spoke of relief too long deferred. Lucy was at her mother's side instantly, small arms wrapping around Rosie's trembling form. "It's okay, Mama," she murmured. "We're safe now. We found shelter over our heads just like I promised we would." Jake busied himself with the horses, giving the two women privacy for their reunion with Hope. But he couldn't help overhearing Lucy's gentle words, the way she comforted her mother with a maturity that should have belonged to someone decades older. The role reversal was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. The first few weeks at the Morrison Ranch established a routine that surprised Jake with its natural rhythm. Lucy threw herself into every task with enthusiasm, her small hands proving surprisingly capable at everything from gathering eggs to mending fence wire. She had an intuitive understanding of animals that came from necessity rather than formal training, and the ranch's few remaining cattle seemed to sense her gentle nature. Rose remained silent, but her contributions were no less valuable. She took over the kitchen with quiet efficiency, somehow managing to create filling meals from the meager supplies in Jake's pantry. Her touch was evident everywhere, in the way she arranged wildflowers on the table, in the careful mending of torn curtains, in the gradual transformation of a bachelor's functional space into something that felt like a home. More importantly, Jake began to notice Rose responding to her new environment in small but significant ways. She would stand at the kitchen window each morning, watching the sunrise paint the hills in gentle colors. She started a small garden behind the house, her movements deliberate and purposeful as she worked the soil with her hands. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, Jake caught glimpses of the woman she'd been before trauma stole her voice, intelligent, capable, with an inner strength that ran deeper than her current silence. It was Lucy who suggested they visit the town library during their next trip to Redemption Creek for supplies. "Mama loves books," she explained to Jake as they walked down the main street. Maybe if she had something to read, something to think about besides remembering bad things, it might help. The librarian, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Henderson, initially viewed their small group with suspicion. But when Rose approached the botanical section and began carefully examining the volumes there, her face transformed with genuine interest for the first time since Jake had met her. "She knows plants," Mrs. Henderson observed, her tone shifting from suspicion to curiosity. "Look at how she handles those books. Like she understands what she's seeing." Rose had opened a thick volume on native Texas flora and was comparing its illustrations to something in her own small notebook. Her fingers moved across the pages with reverence, and Jake saw her lips move silently, as if she were reading passages aloud in her mind. "My mama used to teach school," Lucy said proudly. "She knows all about growing things and healing plants. She's been teaching me, but we don't have enough books." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened completely. "Well then, she's welcome to borrow whatever she needs. And Lucy, I have some primers that might interest you as well. Education shouldn't stop just because circumstances change." As they left the library with an armload of books, Jake noticed something different in Rose's posture. She walked with more purpose, her head held higher, and there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Purpose, he realized, could be as healing as medicine for certain kinds of wounds. The change became more pronounced in the following days. Rose threw herself into expanding her garden with scientific precision, consulting her new books and making careful notes in her journal. She began preparing tinctures and salves from the plants she grew, and when Jake cut his hand on a piece of broken harness, the poultice she made healed the wound faster than he'd expected. "Mama's making medicine again," Lucy confided to Jake one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "She used to help sick folks back home, before the bad thing. The doctor said she was better with plant cures than most people with fancy degrees." Jake filed this information away alongside his growing understanding of the two women who'd transformed his lonely existence into something richer and more complicated. He was beginning to see possibilities he hadn't considered before, ways their combined strengths might create opportunities none of them could manage alone. The turning point came in early autumn, when old Tom Bradley rode up to the ranch looking like death warmed over. Tom owned the spread adjacent to Jake's property, and the two men had maintained a cordial if distant relationship for years. Now Tom slumped in his saddle, his face gray with pain and fever. "Jake," he called weakly, "I hate to impose, but I'm feeling poorly, and Martha's visiting her sister in San Antonio. Don't suppose you'd have any whiskey to spare?" Before Jake could respond, Rose appeared on the porch, took one look at Tom's condition, and hurried down the steps. She placed a gentle hand on his forehead, her expression growing concerned as she felt his fever. Then she was moving with purpose, disappearing into the house and returning with a basket of supplies. "Mom, I don't want to trouble you," Tom protested weakly, but Rose was already preparing something from her collection of dried herbs. She mixed a tea with practiced efficiency and handed it to him with a look that brooked no argument. "Drink it all," Lucy translated, somehow understanding her mother's silent communication perfectly. "Mama says you've got the fever sickness and this will help break it. But you need to rest, not ride home alone." Tom looked skeptically at the herbal mixture, but desperation won over stubbornness. He drank it down, grimacing at the bitter taste. Within an hour, his fever had begun to break, and color was returning to his weathered cheeks. "I'll be damned," he murmured, looking at Rose with new respect. "Begging your pardon, Mom, but that's better than any medicine I've ever taken." "Where'd you learn to do that?" Rose smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her, and gestured toward her books and garden. The story came out in pieces, translated by Lucy and supplemented by Rose's expressive gestures. Her knowledge of herbal medicine, her desire to help people, her fear that her silence made her useless in a world that valued words above wisdom. Tom listened intently, his businessman's mind clearly working. "Mom," he said finally, "I don't know what happened to take your voice, and I'm not going to pry. But I'll tell you what I do know: half the folks in this county would pay good money for medicine that actually works. Doc Peterson in town is getting old, and his remedies aren't what they used to be. If you were willing, I think there'd be a market for what you can do." The idea took root and grew over the following weeks. Tom spread word carefully among his neighbors about the quiet woman who could cure fevers and heal wounds with plant medicines. People began arriving at the Morrison Ranch, initially skeptical but increasingly hopeful as Rose's treatments proved their worth. She worked with quiet confidence, diagnosing ailments through careful observation and gentle touch, preparing customized remedies for each patient. Lucy served as her voice, somehow intuiting her mother's thoughts and translating them for visitors. The child's natural empathy and growing knowledge of healing plants made her an invaluable assistant. Jake found himself managing the business side of their unexpected enterprise, collecting payments, keeping records, and ensuring their patients felt welcome. His ranch, which had been dying slowly from isolation and financial strain, began to buzz with activity and purpose. The money helped, certainly. Rose's patients paid what they could, and even small amounts added up over time. But more importantly, Jake watched Rose bloom like one of her medicinal plants, finally receiving proper care. She had found her voice again, not in words but in purpose. Her silence was no longer an absence but a different kind of presence, filled with healing intention and quiet strength. Winter arrived with unusual gentleness that year, as if the world itself had decided to be kind to the small family that had formed around shared need and mutual respect. The ranch house glowed with warmth that came from more than just the fireplace. Rose had made curtains for all the windows, soon from fabric she'd traded for her medicines. Lucy's laughter rang through rooms that had been silent for too many years, and Jake discovered that the loneliness he'd carried like a stone in his chest had somehow transformed into contentment. Christmas morning brought an unexpected gift when Rose approached Jake with a small, wrapped package. Inside was a drawing she'd made of the ranch house, but not as it could be. She'd sketched in repairs and improvements, a larger garden, even a small sign by the gate that read, "Morrison Ranch Herbal Remedies." "Mama's been planning," Lucy explained, bouncing with excitement. "She wants to make the ranch into a real healing place, where people can come not just for medicine, but to learn about plants and growing things. She thinks we could teach other women to make their own remedies." Jake studied the drawing, seeing not just Rose's artistic vision, but her hope for a future they could build together. "It's a beautiful dream," he said carefully. "But something like this would take time, and money we don't have." Rose reached for her journal and wrote something, then showed it to Jake. Her handwriting was clear and determined. "Dreams become real one seed at a time." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew them to the window. A small group of riders was making its way up the road to the ranch house, and Jake recognized Tom Bradley at their head. Behind him rode several other local ranchers and their families, all carrying packages and wearing expressions of determined good cheer. "Merry Christmas, Morrison family," Tom called out as they dismounted. Jake noticed he'd used the word family, deliberately including Rose and Lucy in the greeting without hesitation. "We brought some things to help with your expansion plans." What followed was a day of revelations. The community had been quietly organizing, pooled their resources to support Rose's healing practice. There were building supplies for expanding the garden, lumber for constructing a proper workshop, even a set of scales for accurately measuring medicines. But most importantly, there were commitments from several families to send their daughters to learn from Rose, to carry her knowledge forward to their own communities. "You've given us something precious," Mrs. Patterson explained to Rose, her arthritic hands moving more freely than they had in years thanks to Rose's willow bark salve. "You've given us hope that healing doesn't have to come from far away or cost more than we can afford. The least we can do is help you share that gift with others." Rose's response was written in tears of gratitude and gestures of welcome. She moved through the group of neighbors like a blessing, touching hands and shoulders, her silence somehow conveying more thanks than words could have managed. That evening, as the visitors departed and the three of them sat by the fire, Jake reflected on the strange turns life could take. A year ago, he'd been a man slowly giving up on his dreams, watching his heritage crumble into dust. Now he was part of something larger and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined possible. Lucy had fallen asleep curled against her mother's side, her small face peaceful in the firelight. Rose sat with one hand gently stroking her daughter's hair, her eyes fixed on the flames with an expression of quiet satisfaction. When she noticed Jake watching, she smiled and gestured toward the window, where the first stars of evening were appearing. Jake understood. They had found their place in the constellation of community, each of them contributing light to a pattern larger than themselves. Rose's silence had become a form of wisdom, teaching others to listen more carefully and speak with greater intention. Lucy's resilience had shown them all that children could be both vulnerable and strong, deserving protection while offering their own unique gifts. And Jake had learned that shelter wasn't just about roofs and walls, it was about creating space for others to heal and grow. As winter deepened into the promise of spring, the Morrison Ranch continued to evolve. Rose's students began arriving, young women from neighboring ranches, eager to learn the old knowledge of plant medicine. Lucy proved to be a natural teacher herself, her patience and clarity helping others understand concepts that might have seemed intimidating from an adult instructor. Jake found himself expanding his role beyond simple ranch work. He built raised beds for Rose's medicinal gardens, constructed a small classroom in one of the outbuildings, and even learned to identify and harvest some of the more common healing plants himself. The ranch was becoming something new, a hybrid of traditional farming and innovative education that served their community's growing needs. The most remarkable change came gradually in Rose herself. While she never regained her spoken voice, she developed other forms of communication that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. Her touch could convey comfort and understanding, her expression spoke volumes about diagnosis and treatment, and her written instructions, carefully crafted in her precise handwriting, became treasured resources for her students to copy and carry home. More importantly, Rose began to laugh again, not with sound, but with her whole being, eyes sparkling, shoulders shaking with silent mirth at Lucy's stories or Jake's clumsy attempts at gardening. Joy, Jake realized, didn't require words any more than wisdom did. The first anniversary of their meeting approached with the promise of a celebration that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The ranch was thriving. Rose's reputation as a healer had spread throughout the region, and Lucy was growing into a confident young lady who could translate between her mother's silent wisdom and a world that sometimes spoke too much and listened too little. On the morning of that anniversary, Jake found Rose and Lucy in the garden, working side by side to plant seeds that would become next year's medicine. The sight filled him with a contentment so deep it felt like coming home after a journey he hadn't realized he'd been taking. "Mr. Jake," Lucy called out, her voice carrying the music of complete security. "Mama wants to know if you think these marigolds will grow big enough to help with Mrs. Johnson's skin troubles." Jake knelt beside them, studying the tiny seeds in Rose's palm. "I think," he said carefully, "that anything your mama plants has a good chance of growing into exactly what it's meant to be." Rose met his eyes and smiled, her expression holding depths of gratitude, affection, and hope that no words could have adequately conveyed. In her silence, Jake had learned to hear a different kind of voice, one that spoke of resilience, love, and the healing power of creating shelter not just over heads, but around hearts. Spring arrived at the Morrison Ranch with a celebration that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The entire community gathered to witness the dedication of Rose's new teaching center, a beautiful building constructed with contributions from dozens of families who had benefited from her healing wisdom. Lucy, now 10 years old and tall for her age, stood proudly beside her mother as the ribbon was cut. Rose had become legendary throughout the region, known not just for her healing abilities but for her innovative teaching methods. Students came from as far as San Antonio to learn her techniques, and several had already established successful practices in their own communities. Her written manuals, carefully illustrated and lovingly crafted, were becoming treasured resources passed from mother to daughter across Texas. The celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing and stories shared around bonfires that painted the gathering in warm, golden light. Jake found himself standing apart from the festivities, overwhelmed by the transformation of his once dying ranch into this thriving center of learning and healing. "Mr. Jake?" Lucy's voice interrupted his reverie. She approached with her characteristic confidence, now seasoned with the wisdom that came from helping her mother teach dozens of eager students. "Mama wants to show you something." She led him to the edge of Rose's garden, where a new section had been planted with flowers that bloomed in the moonlight. Rose stood waiting among the night, blooming serious, her journal open to a fresh page. In her careful handwriting, she had written a single sentence that made Jake's throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for giving us a place where our silence could become a song." As Jake read those words, he understood that their journey had come full circle. The desperate little girl, who had asked for shelter over their heads, had found something infinitely more valuable. She had discovered that true shelter wasn't just about protection from the elements. It was about creating space for healing, growth, and love to flourish. Rose's silence had become a powerful form of communication, teaching others to listen with their hearts instead of just their ears. And Jake had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts came not from what we said, but from what we were willing to receive and nurture in return. Years would pass, and the Morrison Ranch would continue to evolve and grow. Lucy would eventually become a renowned healer in her own right, traveling throughout the West to establish healing centers based on her mother's methods. Rose would never regain her spoken voice, but her legacy would speak through countless lives touched by her wisdom and compassion. And Jake would look back on that dusty afternoon in Redemption Creek as the moment his real life began, not when he stopped being alone, but when he learned that family was something you built with intention, patience, and love. The little girl who had once asked a cowboy for shelter over their heads had taught them all that sometimes the most profound promises were kept not with words, but with open hearts, willing hands, and the courage to believe that broken things could be made whole again. In finding shelter for others, they had all found their way home,